The next section is incorporating both ethics and ESG and best practice in financial planning. I guess it's relatively standard that investors now are expecting their advisors to at least reflect some positive values in ethical investing. It's certainly something we've been talking about all day today. Australian Ethical Group talked about that today as well. I guess they want advisors to walk the walk, not just talk the talk about this sort of stuff. So it's important we get a grasp on how you fit into your portfolio. So I've got Greg Liddell from BetaShares. Welcome. Will take us through, I guess, how you incorporate both ethics, ESG and your best practice.
Thank you.
Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. I didn't get a round of applause in Melbourne. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we meet today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. It's nice to be, actually, the last time I was in this room was 4 years ago, an investor group on climate change conference, which is probably pretty topical given I think Australian Ethical has gone through some of the ways in which climate change in the environment and the policy settings have changed in those 4 years. It's been quite remarkable where we were then and where we are. Just briefly introduce BetaShares. We're a leader in exchange-traded funds in Australia. I've got in my notes that we have 74 funds. As of Monday, we actually have as of Tuesday, we have 76 funds with over 22 billion in assets under management. We're a signatory to the UN Principles of Responsible Investment. We're a member of the Responsible Investment Association of Australasia. We have a suite of 8 ethical ETFs, all of which have been accredited by RIA. We are committed to being transparent. There we go. We're committed to being transparent and true to label. Our approach to responsible investment and investment stewardship can be found on our website. Okay, ethics. What is ethics? One of the things that makes us human is that we... these have not come out great, which is a pity. One of the things that makes us human is our ability to make choices. In any situation, we can make a decision about what we could do and what we should do. Ethics is that thing that tells us to put aside our desires and our own self-interest and to do what is right. Unfortunately, life is not always simple and things are not always black and white, and what the right thing to do is not always obvious. Ethics is a framework for navigating the grey. If you do any courses on ethics, and I've done 1 or 2 over the years, you generally find that they'll talk about a checklist of questions that you can come up with to test whether or not your decisions are ethical. A good one is always, how would I feel if the decision I made was on the front page of tomorrow's AFR? What would be the consequences if everybody in this industry made the same decision? And how does this decision reflect on my character? Can I be proud of my decision? Ethics involves complexity. According to Kohlberg's stages of moral development, few people get beyond acting in a way to avoid feelings of guilt. And for most people that's okay. But for professionals, lawyers, accountants, planners, you need an ethical framework. The Ethics Centre, which was formerly the St James Centre for Ethics, talks about an ethical framework being built on three foundations. The first is values, the things we think are important, the things we strive for: honesty, integrity, trust. Principles outline how we can achieve our values: transparency, reliability. One principle I always try to apply in any situation is empathy. You know, if I was the other person in this relationship or this transaction or this situation, how would I feel about the decision that I make? And finally, purpose. In a situation or a role or a relationship, what is my purpose? How we act and the decisions that we make needed to be guided by our purpose in any relationship. As an advisor, you have a particular purpose, and that purpose has consequences for the decisions that you make and the advice you give. Okay. Prior to its demise, Toby, where is Toby? Toby was telling me that FASEA had a fair bit, that IMAP had a fair bit of input to the FASEA code of ethics. I find FASEA a little bit of an interesting, now that it's gone, a little bit of an interesting blip in the industry's history, given it was really set up, I think it was more of an initiative from Malcolm Turnbull to prevent having a Royal Commission. We ended up having the Royal Commission, but FASEA hung around anyway and delivered its code of ethics after I think we'd already established that as far as ethics were concerned, it wasn't so much a problem of individual behaviours as it was systemic structures. But before we actually get to the code, I mean, one of the interesting things about having a code is that it makes an assumption that ethics can be codified, and many people would say no. You know, if you talk to academics in the field for their entire careers, they'd tell you codification on ethics it's not a good idea. But yet we've got a code. We've got a code of ethics. The underlying assumption there is that everyone in the profession will use the same professional rules, regardless of their personal values and principles. And secondly, it tells us that it is possible to codify a set of ethical principles that can be applied to every ethical dilemma that a professional may come up with. And again, that I think is questionable. The problem of having a published code of ethics is it very, very quickly becomes a compliance checklist. And you know, we talk about what do we have to do to comply with the code rather than taking a step back and thinking about ethical principles. As I'm sure you guys have all gone through FASEA Code of Ethics training and are aware that the code has come in for some criticism. FASEA Standard 3, you must not advise, refer or act in any manner where you have a conflict of interest or duty. That's unworkable. I mean, that is genuinely unworkable. If you look at other codes of ethics for other professions, very few of them, I haven't seen one of them that says you must have no conflicts of interest. You must manage your conflicts of interest. You must disclose your conflicts of interest, but to have no conflicts at all in any professional fields is virtually impossible. Prior to being shut down, FASEA issued a consultation document. Oh, by the way, the Code of Ethics is now on the Treasury website, if anyone's looking for it. and you've really got to go looking for it. It's not particularly obvious where it now resides. FASIO issued a consultation document which included a number of alternatives for Standard 3. The one I thought was most apt was you must not receive any benefit, whether monetary or non-monetary, nor enter into any relationship that could reasonably expected to influence, and the term reasonably expected, to influence the advice you give or the service you provide to your client. I think that's a substantial improvement on the original wording and still captures the intent. Standard 6, you must take into account the broad effects arising from the client acting on your advice and actively consider the client's broader long-term interests and likely circumstances. You need to be fortune tellers. Aged care is given as an example of likely circumstances. This standard has been criticised as being a little too broad and open-ended. The intent of the standard is to make sure you proactively seek and elicit information from your client. However, it is unclear how this standard applies to scaled advice. The implication is you must consider the broad and long-term impacts of your advice, such as the need for aged care for the client or their family members, even if those considerations are outside the scope of your engagement. Should I put my money in ethical ETF A or ethical ETF B? And the next question you've got to go, well, before I answer that, tell me, do you have any older relatives, and what are their likely care needs for the next 20 years? Case studies are a good way to explore ethics. As I said, ethics is one of those things where you codified it, you put it in principles, it all sounds very black and white. It's like a paint by numbers portrait. Until you actually get into case studies and specific circumstances, you don't really have an opportunity to apply those principles in that environment of moral ambiguity. I've summarised 3 case studies from the Advisor Voice website. They're there if you want to have a look at them in more detail. Case study 1 revolves around self-managed superannuation fund advice. The scenario is a couple, Debbie and Jeff, go to an accountant who recommends establishing an SMSF. She is a chef who owns and runs a restaurant. He works for an ASX-listed company. They plan to sell the restaurant in 2 or 3 years and retire, which is probably it's not that uncommon a circumstance. The accountant has given them advice to set up an SMSF for Jeff to transfer the balance of his corporate super account into the SMS now, and for the proceeds from the sale of the restaurant to be transferred in 3 years' time. They go to a planner to establish an investment strategy for the SMSF. The planner runs through a comprehensive Know Your Client process and concludes 3 things. Firstly, that the clients do not understand the roles and responsibilities of acting as a trustee for an SMSF. They don't understand the risks. They don't understand the risks of non-compliance and that they could lose their concessional tax treatment. And they don't have the time. Not only do they don't have the time, they don't have the requisite knowledge to run an SMSF. So the advisor in this circumstance could simply follow the accountant's advice and establish the SMSF. After all, that is what the client is asking for. But coming back to that framework of valuables, principles and purpose, sometimes it's the purpose of an advisor to protect clients from themselves. So the right advice in this instance, and the advice that the planner gave, was not to establish an SMSF. Case study 2 revolves around falsifying documents. And it's not so much about navigating the grey as it just illustrates that the road to hell is often paved with good intentions. A Sydney advisor provided clients with falsified wholesale client certificates. He did it because he believed it was in the client's best interest to gain access to asset classes and investments that they otherwise couldn't. He was audited by ASIC. He lied about it under oath. He falsified evidence. And if you go to FASEA Standard 2, it states you must act in accordance with all applicable laws, including this code, and not try to avoid or circumvent their intent. The consequence was that ASIC deemed he was not fit and proper, and he received a lifetime ban. Now, case study 3, I gave this presentation in Melbourne earlier in the week, and I had a feeling that most of the audience knew who Mark Burgess was. I'm not sure if the name is as familiar in Sydney. Mark was a planner in Melbourne and a Demons fan who decided he'd go to the AFL Grand Final in Perth in contravention of COVID travel restrictions. So nothing to do with advice, nothing to do with his professional life, but ASIC banned him for 10 years. And in its press release, they made the comment that ASIC stated that it was satisfied that the advisor lacks the honesty and integrity to participate in the financial services and credit industries. So this has nothing to do with the advice he gave. This was as to character. FASEA Standard 12 states, individually and in cooperation with peers, you must uphold and promote the ethical standards of the profession and hold each other accountable for the protection of the public interest. Wow, you're responsible for public interest. That's a heavy burden. This is something that is not common in codes of ethics. Typically, a code of ethics is there to cover our individual behaviour, my behaviour. The implication here is that advisors have an obligation to work with peers on upholding professional standards. There is a collective responsibility. That's unusual in codes of ethics. Further, the onus to protect public interest implies that obligation extends beyond work activities. Under Standard 12, Mark Babbage's colleagues, if they knew about his intentions, should have taken every reasonable step to dissuade him from travelling in breach of COVID restrictions. The guidance note states the intent of Standard 12 is being seen to be a professional that acts ethically and professionally. And I would add from the reading of that you can apply all the time. You can't assume that everybody in your practice, has a highly developed and evolved sense of ethics. It's important to educate, restate, and reinforce the importance of integrity, values, and ethical behaviour as a regular part of your educational practices. Now, finally, on ethics, I'd like to talk a little bit about Standard 4, which states you may act for a client only with the client's free, prior and informed consent. Ageing is an issue. Ageing is a real issue in Australia, and elder people don't have the mental faculties they did when they were younger, at least not all the time. In August 2020, Monash University published a study on elder abuse in Victoria. It was a wake-up call to a problem which was more pervasive and serious than most people, and certainly most policymakers, realised. Due to being systematically underreported, the report came to the conclusion that the official rate of elder abuse is about 6% for people over 60, but the report estimated it may be as high as 15%. In 91% of instances, the abuser is a close family member, typically a son or daughter. I've got up here on the slide the common types of abuse that are prevalent. As the proportion of Australia's population over 60 increases, it is probable that you will encounter instances of elder abuse. There's a couple of toolkits around which are quite good for looking at the types of elder abuse, the prevalence of elder abuse, the warning signs, and some actions that you can or can't take. I've got to say the Victorian one is much better than the New South Wales one. I've put up the New South Wales Ageing and Disability Commission website on that slide. But take my advice, if you want to not waste a lot of time, I'd go to the Victorian one first. Nevertheless, the New South Wales site is where you'll find the hotline for elder abuse in New South Wales. For professionals, lawyers, accountants, planners, the best approach on elder abuse is often prevention. The client needs to know, quite frequently, older people don't know what assets they own. They need to know what their assets are, and they need to be told, advised what they need to do to keep those assets safe. In many cases of abuse, the tactic of the abuser is to isolate and control. So one of the things that anybody encountering abuse can do and should do is to encourage the abused party to be more social. And by more social, I mean to engage with other family members, to engage with friends, if they're considering advice, to discuss that advice with people outside the person that is trying to control them. In any event, if you do suspect elder abuse, I would encourage you to call the New South Wales Ageing and Disability Commission hotline, which is on the website. Okay, sustainable investment practice. I'm sure you all know that interest in sustainability is just increasing exponentially every year, and it's not just the younger generation, millennials plus. It is right across the spectrum. People expect their money to be invested ethically and responsibly, and that's not just the end investment, that's right through the value chain. So for a fund manager like BetaShares, it means that we have to be more sustainable in our own operations. One of our recent initiatives actually is we've convened a Green Council, which is made up of both staff and senior executives, and the purpose of that is simply to come through and project manage initiatives to increase sustainable business practice at BetaShares. One of the best ways to be more sustainable is to reduce your carbon footprint. The standard for carbon neutral in Australia is overseen by Climate Active, which operates under the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources. The technical guidance manual for carbon neutral is nice in that it's not actually that technical. It's written in reasonably straightforward language, and most people would be able to understand it. The pathway to carbon neutral is to measure, reduce and offset. Even if you don't wish to push for carbon neutral accreditation, you can and should take reasonable steps to reduce your carbon footprint. out of curiosity, has anyone been actually asked by a client what they're doing about sustainability in their own practice? Yeah, I think it's coming, but I think there might be a little bit of a self-selection in those practices who do take it seriously are marketing on that basis, and there might be some self-selection in that way. Certainly other people I've talked to have said, increasingly sustainable investors and ethical investors are gravitating to practices that are highlighting that in their marketing. So to decrease your carbon footprint, you can buy renewable energy. The body responsible for accrediting green power, renewable energy in Australia is Green Power. You can buy Green Power accredited energy through any of the major energy retailers, should you talk to them. If you don't buy your own electricity, and many people that lease premises don't, then you need to harass your building owner to buy renewable energy. Installing solar panels where you can is a no-brainer. The payback period on a solar panel is 3.8 years and decreasing. Make sure your next vehicle is an electric vehicle. There's been plenty of modelling done. The lifetime costs of an EV now are substantially below an internal combustion engine vehicle, and again, harass your building owner to put charging infrastructure into parking. Finally, if all that else can't fail, one of the things that you can do is just turn devices off at the plug. Standby or what they call vampire power accounts for 10 to 12% of all electricity. You can get a simple device called a smart strip, which is Wi-Fi programmable, and it can turn off computers, printers, coffee machines, etc., etc. The one I've got up there on the slide is $48 from Amazon, and can pay for itself very quickly. A little bit on carbon credits. Carbon credits have been in the news controversially of late. A carbon credit offsets a tonne of carbon. So if you emit a tonne of carbon in your business, you buy a carbon credit, then theoretically you are net neutral. Just be aware that there are some really dodgy carbon credits out there, particularly overseas. I think we had the term net zero suffered, was devalued substantially when the French oil and gas company Total sold a tanker, a sea tanker of liquefied natural gas to the Chinese CNOOC in China, and claimed it was carbon neutral on the basis of some very, very dodgy African carbon credits. In Australia, ACCUs, Australian Carbon Credit Units, which are overseen by the Clean Energy Regulator, have historically been regarded as being of reasonable integrity. However, the Clean Energy Regulator a few years back was restructured. The person in charge of integrity left and was replaced by someone who was a former lobbyist for the oil and gas industry. And funnily enough, some research has shown that pretty much since that point on, the integrity of Australian carbon credit unions has been debased. So you can, if you choose, go and buy carbon credits. I'd make sure you identified where they come from. If you want to do that exercise, a very, very, very good resource is the Carbon Market Institute website. They have a marketplace hub there that has a list and contact details for consultants, but also brokers and traders who can give you a lot of information about how you can actually go and buy a carbon credit unit. On waste, those of you who saw Craig Rucastle's documentary, The War on Waste, would be familiar with the numbers in Australia. They're not good. On average, we produce 540 kilograms of trash each every year. That's 78 million tonnes of landfill, more than double the average European. That includes 3.5 million tonnes of plastic and 1 billion disposable coffee cups. The Planet Ark War on Waste Toolkit is a good resource for reducing waste, lots of ideas, and again it's something that the BetaShares Green Council is trying to apply as much as it can. Buying products with sustainable packaging, recycling absolutely everything. The council-based systems are okay, they're not great, but nowadays we have specialist recycling on just about everything. So, Simply Cups there do coffee cup recycling. You can't actually put a coffee cup in council-based schemes. They're not recyclable. So Simply Cups, you can get a little 3-tube module there for coffee cup recycling. Coffee pods. The guy who invented the coffee pod bitterly regrets it. There are 1 trillion of these things every year. Vast majority of them end up in landfill. There's now specialist recycling for coffee pots. Soft plastics, electronic waste. We should all do everything we can to prevent a battery going into landfill. Nothing good comes from a battery being thrown into the ground and being left to spew what is pretty toxic chemicals into the environment. And finally, avoid disposable items and single-use and single-use plastics. Buy a dishwasher, buy crockery. That's a lot better for the environment. Okay, so just to summarise, ethics are not a set of rules that can be codified, although codes of ethics have their place. But rather, ethics is a compass for navigating life's grey. The word ethics actually comes from the Greek ethos, which means character. But if you do a little bit of Greek philosophy, one of the terms you come across very quickly is arete. If you read Socrates, you talk about arete, which is there's no real English equivalent, but you're talking about concepts of virtue and excellence, and I think that's what, as a profession, so it's what we all need to strive for. Sustainability is intrinsically linked to ethics. Many years ago at university, I remember writing a paper on intergenerational reciprocity, which sounds a little bit pretentious, but it just means that we inherited a planet in which we've lived, we've thrived. That planet has a stock of natural capital. There's a value of that planet that we've enjoyed. That places on us an ethical obligation to pass on to the next generation those things that we've been a beneficiary of. Thank you.